There is a moment on the trading floor when nobody speaks, when $357 billion simply evaporates in a single afternoon, and the man who built the empire watching it disappear is the calmest person alive. Until now, because sources inside Redmond say Bill Gates is not calm anymore, and by the time you finish this video, you will understand exactly why. For 50 years, Bill Gates has walked into boardrooms, courtrooms, and congressional hearings with the same unshakable composure, the same quiet confidence of a man who has already seen every possible disaster and survived it. Even when Microsoft was losing the browser war to a scrappy little program called Netscape. Even when federal prosecutors dragged the company through an antitrust trial so brutal, a judge ordered it broken into pieces, Gates never let the mask slip in public. That composure was the brand. That composure was the myth. And according to a wave of reporting building since early March of 2026, that composure has finally cracked. The reason has a name, and it is deliberately, almost mockingly, close to Microsoft's own, close enough that every time someone says it out loud in a Redmond hallway, it lands like a slap. It is called Macrohard. And before you dismiss this as just another Elon Musk headline stunt designed to dominate a news cycle for 48 hours, you need to understand exactly how far this project has already gone, how much capital is already sitting behind it, and why its arrival lines up perfectly with the single worst trading day in Microsoft's modern history. Let's start with the date Microsoft employees will not forget for a very long time, January 29th, 2026. That Thursday, immediately following Microsoft's second quarter earnings report for fiscal year 2026, the stock collapsed by roughly 10% in a single trading session, wiping out approximately $357 billion in market value before the closing bell rang, the second largest single-day valuation loss in the history of the American stock market, trailing only Nvidia's own collapse the previous year, when a low-cost model out of China rattled the entire artificial intelligence trade to its foundations. To put that number into something resembling human terms, $357 billion is larger than the total combined value of more than 90% of every single company listed on the S&P 500, gone in one afternoon, gone before most employees had even finished their lunch. And here is the detail that should genuinely stop you cold. Microsoft did not miss its numbers, not even close. Revenue rose 17% to $81.3 billion. Earnings per share landed at $4.14, comfortably clearing the $3.91 estimate Wall Street had modeled. Operating margins sat at a healthy 47.1%. Microsoft's cloud division crossed $50 billion in quarterly revenue for the very first time in company history. On paper, on every traditional metric investors have used for decades, that is one of the strongest quarters Microsoft has ever reported. So why did the market erase the equivalent of an entire Fortune 100 company in a single afternoon? Because underneath the glossy headline numbers, investors saw something that terrified them far more than a bad quarter ever could. A company spending at a pace that no longer made rational sense, propping up an artificial intelligence product that the very employees it was built for were quietly, systematically refusing to use. Microsoft's capital expenditure for that single quarter hit $37.5 billion, up 66% from the year before. An almost incomprehensible escalation. So then, Chief Financial Officer Amy Hood raised the full-year forecast to a staggering $190 billion, a figure so far beyond what analysts had priced into their models that it forced an immediate and brutal recalculation of the company's entire cash position. Free cash flow fell to $15.8 billion for the quarter, a 22% drop year over year. Azure grew 39%, which sounds impressive, until you realize the market had already priced in 41%. And when you were spending $190 billion a year chasing a single technology bet, missing expectations by just 2 percentage points is enough to trigger an absolute stampede for the exits. If this is the kind of story that makes your stomach tighten a little, stay with me, because we have not even reached the part with Musk's name on it yet. To understand exactly how a company with $1 trillion market capitalization ended up in a position where its own most loyal users were quietly walking out the back door before any rival ever built a front door to replace it, you have to rewind and look at the decisions that built this resentment layer by layer, year after year. Quietly, patiently, almost invisibly, until the pressure finally became impossible to contain. When Windows 11 launched, Microsoft's own compatibility checker confirmed that more than half of every existing Windows 10 computer on Earth could not run it. Not because those machines were slow, not because they were broken, but simply because they lacked a specific security chip called TPM 2.0 that only became standard in consumer hardware around 2016. Analysts at Canalys calculated the number of perfectly functional personal computers pushed toward obsolescence by that single requirement at roughly 240 million machines. And if you stacked every one of those discarded laptops folded flat on top of each other, The pile would reach 600 kilometers into the sky, higher than the internationally recognized edge of space itself. And here is the detail that makes it sting even harder. Microsoft was simultaneously publishing glossy sustainability reports and carbon neutrality pledges, while its own product strategy quietly accelerated one of the largest waves of premature electronic waste in modern technological history. But the hardware barrier was only the first layer of frustration, not the last. Windows 11. Home required a Microsoft account just to finish the installation process, with no realistic offline setup path for most everydays. Consumers, and the ability to create a simple local account, something that had existed inside Windows since its very earliest versions, was buried behind deliberate friction and then quietly removed altogether. When technically skilled users discovered workarounds, Microsoft patched them out one by one, methodically, as if closing every possible exit from a room. Even Rufus, the free open source tool used by millions of IT professionals worldwide to create bootable. Windows installation drives ran into sudden download blocks that its own developer, Pete Betard, stated publicly were not accidental at all, but the direct result of a deliberate configuration decision made somewhere deep inside Microsoft's own infrastructure. And the reason behind all of this stops being confusing the moment you follow the business model to its logical conclusion. Every single user forced through a Microsoft account during setup instantly becomes a target for a Microsoft 365 subscription pitch, a OneDrive storage upsell, another data point feeding an advertising engine. Once inside Windows 11, the monetization never really stopped, not for a single moment. The Start menu quietly surfaces paid promotional placements between your own pinned applications. The File Explorer nags you toward cloud storage you never asked for. The lock screen runs sponsored tips disguised as helpful advice. The Widgets panel serves advertising directly alongside your local weather forecast. Users who paid hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars for their own physical hardware discovered that the operating system running on it had quietly become a billboard, marketing products back at them continuously every single time they opened their own laptop. And by 2025, independent security researchers had documented nearly 12,000 vulnerabilities across Windows 11, an increase of more than 800% from the year before, while emergency patches were routinely shipped out simply to repair damage caused by the previous round of emergency patches, an exhausting, never-ending cycle that left IT departments around the world quietly furious. Against that backdrop, the numbers behind Microsoft's flagship artificial intelligence product, Copilot, land very, very differently than the marketing department would like you to believe. Measured against roughly 450 million active Microsoft 365 subscribers worldwide, Copilot's actual paid user base sat at around 15 million, an adoption rate of just over 3% on a product Microsoft spent tens of billions of dollars developing, marketing, and forcing into every corner of its ecosystem. Microsoft has publicly claimed that 70% of Fortune 500 companies have adopted Copilot in some form, a statistic that sounds impressive, splashed across a keynote slide, but when independent analysts actually examined that adoption in practice, the entire picture quietly fell apart. Only about 6% of those companies had fully deployed Copilot across their workforce in any meaningful way. Roughly 72% remained permanently stuck in limited pilot programs, with no defined timeline and no realistic path toward full rollout. And nearly half of all provisioned Copilot seats, licenses Microsoft had already been paid for, had simply been abandoned entirely by the employees they were originally assigned to. Even inside Microsoft's own walls, when its own engineers quietly evaluated Copilot against competing artificial intelligence coding tools, independent assessments found ChatGPT scoring 97% for ease of use against Copilot's 86%. And multiple engineers were reportedly paying for ChatGPT subscriptions directly out of their own pockets, rather than relying on the flagship tool their own employer had spent billions of dollars building specifically for them. Meanwhile, the users Microsoft had spent years quietly frustrating found somewhere else entirely to go. They did not wait for permission. Zorin OS 18, a Linux-based operating system deliberately designed to feel instantly familiar to a displaced Windows user, launched on October 14th of 2025, the exact same day Microsoft officially ended mainstream support for Windows 10. And that timing was not an accident. It was a declaration. Within 48 hours, it had logged more than 100,000 downloads. Within a single month, that number crossed 1 million. By January of 2026, the Zorin team confirmed total downloads had surpassed 2 million, with more than 3/4 of those downloads coming directly from displaced Windows devices, not from existing Linux enthusiasts, simply switching distributions. Windows Central, a publication that covers Microsoft's own ecosystem for a living, openly described it as one of the biggest Linux stories of the entire year. And governments around the world noticed too. quietly, methodically, moving away from a vendor they no longer felt they could fully trust. Germany's state of Schleswig-Holstein began migrating 30,000 government computers off Microsoft products entirely. France's National Gendarmerie already runs more than 100,000 machines on Linux, documenting a 40% reduction in total cost of ownership along the way. Global Linux desktop market share climbed from under 3% in mid-2022 to nearly 5% by the end of 2025, with markets like India already sitting well past 16%. This is the exact environment Macrohard is stepping directly into, not a stable, unshakable monopoly, but a company whose own most loyal users had already quietly started walking out the back door long before Elon Musk ever built the front door designed to replace it. Now let's talk about what Macrohard actually is, because the name alone is not the story, the ambition behind it is. In August of 2025, Musk filed a trademark application for a project explicitly positioned as a direct rival to Microsoft's entire software empire, an artificial intelligence system built by his company xAI, designed not to simply chat or generate images, but to autonomously write software, manage complex projects, debug its own mistakes, and eventually simulate the functional output of an entire trillion-dollar software company using AI agents instead of human employees. The name itself is a taunt, a wink, a public dare aimed directly at the empire Bill Gates spent 5 decades building. And the infrastructure behind that dare is not imaginary. It is sitting in Memphis, Tennessee, inside a supercomputer complex reportedly housing more than 500,000 NVIDIA GPUs, one of the largest concentrations of raw artificial intelligence computing power anywhere on the planet. So where does that leave the man whose name is still synonymous with Microsoft itself in the public imagination? Bill Gates has not issued any lengthy public statement about Macrohard, and he almost certainly never will, because that is simply not how a man who has spent 50 years carefully managing his public image chooses to operate. But the silence itself is telling in its own way. Satya Nadella, the chief executive who has run Microsoft's day-to-day operations since 2014, has been forced to respond in the only language investors actually listen to, spending enormous, staggering, almost reckless spending. That $190 billion capital expenditure figure for fiscal year 2026 is Nadella's answer to Musk, a massive bet that outspending every competitor on data centers and NVIDIA chips can buy Microsoft's way back to relevance the same way aggressive spending bought its way into cloud dominance a full decade earlier. But spending money and earning genuine trust are not the same thing, and the market made that distinction with brutal clarity on January 29th. You can post record-breaking revenue and still lose $357 billion in a single afternoon if investors no longer believe the spending is actually buying anything durable. That is the trap Nadella is standing inside right now, and it has almost nothing to do with Musk personally. He simply arrived carrying a provocative name on a supercomputer and a very public feud with Gates at precisely the moment that trap became visible to absolutely everyone watching. And it would be intellectually dishonest to present Macrohard as some kind of guaranteed Microsoft killer, because any script telling you that with total certainty is selling you a fantasy instead of an honest forecast. Building an artificial intelligence system capable of reliably navigating unpredictable software environments, debugging its own mistakes, managing complex multi-step projects entirely without human oversight, and doing all of that with genuine enterprise-grade consistency is an extraordinarily difficult engineering problem, one that has humbled far better funded and far more experienced teams than xAI before. Musk's own track record with ambitious public timelines is not exactly reassuring either. The same man promising to essentially simulate a trillion-dollar software company through artificial intelligence also promised fully self-driving cars within a single year, multiple years running, promised 500,000, Cybertrucks annually that never materialized anywhere close to that number, and promised humans walking on Mars by 2026, a date that has already quietly, silently passed without a single crewed mission ever leaving Earth's orbit. So skepticism here is not just reasonable, it is honestly the responsible position for anyone who has watched Musk announce ambitious moonshot projects before and seen how many of them eventually landed somewhere far short of the original promise. But here's exactly why this provocation should not simply be filed away and forgotten. The moment the headlines fade, Macrohard does not need to fully succeed in order to genuinely hurt Microsoft. It only needs to accelerate a trend that is already visibly underway, with or without Musk's direct involvement. Microsoft's own chief executive has already publicly confirmed that artificial intelligence now writes more than 30% of the company's own code using tools built entirely inside Microsoft's own walls. Independent artificial intelligence systems are already demonstrating that agentic software, capable of completing multi-step office tasks completely autonomously, is a shipping product today, not some distant hypothetical sitting years in the future. The real question here was never really whether artificial intelligence would eventually reshape how software gets built, tested, and maintained, because that transformation is already actively happening inside Microsoft's own headquarters as you watch this video. The real question is who ends up controlling that transformation, and whether the massive global workforce Microsoft currently employs to run its sprawling software empire remains genuinely necessary once a sufficiently capable multi-agent system can perform a meaningful share of that same work for a fraction of the total cost. Every single dollar of that $190 billion Microsoft is spending to defend its position is ultimately a bet that human-led software development remains structurally necessary for the foreseeable future. Musk is betting the exact opposite, and he has staked an entire supercomputer complex in Memphis housing more than 500,000 NVIDIA GPUs as collateral behind that bet. Bill Gates built Microsoft on a simple, almost quaint promise for its era: a computer on every desk and in every home. And that promise succeeded so completely, so thoroughly, that Windows quietly became invisible, the unquestioned default nobody ever really thought twice about, the operating system people simply used because it was already sitting there the moment they opened the box. And what has happened over the past several years is that Microsoft slowly, deliberately traded away that invisible default advantage in exchange for short-term subscription revenue, forcing accounts on users who'd never asked for them, inserting advertisements into spaces that used to belong entirely to the customer, restricting basic choice, and quietly treating decades of loyal users as monetization targets rather than customers genuinely worth keeping happy for the long haul. The consumer default that took 30 patient years to build has visibly, publicly cracked in the space of just a few short years, entirely because of decisions Microsoft made about its own product long before Elon Musk ever filed a single trademark application back in August of 2025. Macrohard did not create Microsoft's vulnerability out of thin air. It simply found it, named it with a joke that stings precisely because it is so uncomfortably accurate, and then pointed hundreds of billions of dollars of raw computing infrastructure directly at the wound. And whether Macrohard ultimately dethrones Microsoft outright or eventually joins the long growing list of Musk ventures that generated enormous headlines and comparatively smaller real-world results, the deeper story here was never really about either man individually. It is about what happens to any institution, no matter how dominant it appears from the outside, no matter how untouchable its market position seems, the moment it stops genuinely listening to the exact people who made it dominant in the first place. Microsoft did not lose 240 million potential customers to obsolescence, did not lose millions of downloads to Zorin OS, did not lose entire government computer fleets to Linux migrations across Europe and Asia, and did not lose $357 billion in a single trading session because some rival simply built marginally better software. It lost all of that, piece by piece, quarter after quarter, because it slowly, methodically decided that its own users' patience was some kind of infinite resource it could spend recklessly without ever having to pay any of it back. Bill Gates spent 5 decades carefully building a company on the sheer strength of that patience, brick by brick, decade by decade. And the question hanging heavily over Redmond's executive floors right now, the question nobody inside that building wants to say out loud in front of a reporter, is whether patience like that, once fully spent, can actually ever be earned back at all. There is another layer to this story that rarely makes it into the headlines, and it might be the most uncomfortable part of all: the way Microsoft's own workforce is reacting to the artificial intelligence push happening around them in real time. Internal surveys leaked to reporters throughout early 2026 describe an engineering culture increasingly split between two camps, one group racing to integrate Copilot and AI-assisted development into every corner of the company's products because leadership demands visible proof of AI transformation for every earnings call, and another group quietly documenting how often that same technology produces unreliable, unpredictable results in production environments where mistakes are not just embarrassing but expensive. Employees who once described working at Microsoft as a stable, prestigious career path now describe an atmosphere thick with uncertainty. Watching leadership publicly celebrate headcount efficiency gains from artificial intelligence while privately wondering whether their own role is next on a list nobody has been shown yet. That tension is not unique to Microsoft, but Microsoft's scale makes it impossible to hide. And every leaked memo, every anonymous forum post, every disgruntled engineer quietly interviewing at a competitor adds another quiet crack to a foundation that used to feel unshakable. Wall Street has started asking a version of the same question analysts once reserved for struggling legacy industries. Is this a growth story or a company spending an almost unimaginable fortune simply to avoid looking left behind? That question sat underneath every single line of Microsoft's January earnings call. And it is the exact question investors answered with their feet the moment trading opened the following morning. Compare that atmosphere to the energy surrounding Macrohard, and the contrast becomes almost uncomfortable to watch. Musk's project has spent months building hype through the exact playbook that turned Tesla and SpaceX into cultural phenomena rather than ordinary companies. Cryptic social media posts, leaked internal Slack screenshots that may or may not be genuine viral demonstration videos showing early prototype agents completing coding tasks in seconds, and a fan base already treating the eventual product launch less like a software release and more like a cultural event. Whether or not the underlying technology can deliver on even a fraction of what the hype promises remains a genuine, eye-open question. But hype itself has become a weapon in this fight, and it is a weapon Microsoft, a 40-plus-year-old institutional giant weighed down by enterprise contracts and shareholder caution, simply cannot wield with the same reckless agility. Every viral Macrohard demo clip that circulates online chips away a little more at the psychological aura of inevitability that used to surround Microsoft's dominance, regardless of whether the underlying product ever ships at the scale being promised. And that psychological shift matters enormously, because markets do not just price current revenue, they price belief about the future, and belief is precisely the currency Microsoft watched evaporate on January 29th. There's also a broader industry pattern worth understanding here, because Microsoft is far from the only legacy technology giant suddenly facing an insurgent challenger built entirely around artificial intelligence rather than decades of accumulated infrastructure. Across the software industry, a new generation of leaner, AI-native competitors are emerging with a fraction of the headcount and a fraction of the legacy technical debt that giants like Microsoft carry into every strategic decision. These smaller rivals do not need to maintain backward compatibility with software written 30 years ago, do not need to service massive enterprise contracts signed under entirely different technological assumptions, and do not need to protect existing revenue streams that a fully AI-native product might quietly cannibalize. That structural freedom is exactly why a project like Macrohard, however uncertain its ultimate success, represents something genuinely different from previous challengers Microsoft has faced and comfortably outlasted before. And if even a fraction of that ambition proves achievable, the economic model that built Microsoft's entire empire, licensing software built and maintained by armies of human engineers, starts to look fundamentally fragile in a way it never has before, at any point across 5 decades of Bill Gates' extraordinary career.